Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Jimmy McCarty, and I am a professor at Boston University in the School of Theology. While there, I also direct the Tom Porter and Religion and Conflict Transformation program. And today, I want to share with you the story of how my community in Tacoma, Washington, came together to heal together from a rise in violence in the city. So it was several years ago now that I was living in Tacoma, Washington, and working there, where I received an invitation to come to a community meeting called by the city government and the city council, and convening people from churches and schools and governmental organizations and local activists and community organizers to have a conversation with one another about how we might want to respond to what was an increase in gun violence that was happening in our city, in particular among our young men, and in particular there, our young men of color, especially Native American, Black, Southeast Asian, and Pacific Islander young men in the ages of about 16 to 24. We had had several high-profile killings, especially in the East Side neighborhood in our city at that time, and we were thinking about ways we would want to respond to that violence. And so the city government and several leaders convened all of us community-based leaders to have this conversation. And we gathered together and we heard the spiel about what the hopes were, and we began to do what we often do in those kinds of spaces. We put a whole bunch of huge Post-its on the walls, and we got into small groups, and we began talking about what our various needs are, the different kinds of work that we all did, and what we thought we might want to do to try to prevent or heal from such healing or such violence in our community. And the conversations began moving, and really quickly, it seemed like there was some energy behind a response that was not unfamiliar to the kinds of responses we had tried before. There was talk about doing a peace march through the city. We actually had recently had one that was led by our local community of indigenous leaders from the Puyallup tribe of Indians, who led a drum peace walk through the city. But we were talking about something much bigger, including many more constituencies to try to think about a big march through the city down to our big event space, which was the Tacoma Dome, where we would have a very famous speaker come in and maybe have something like a rally or a set of a couple of workshops or a series of speakers on stage to call us to peace. And in having those conversations, it came out that, we'd done versions of this before. The city of Tacoma had bouts of increased gun violence in the city, in the East Side, on the Hilltop neighborhood, and in other parts of the city in the 1980s and in the 1990s. That violence was often gang-related violence. The violence that we were experiencing in this century wasn't exactly the same thing as that, but that was a model we had tried before. And so a few folks raised their hands and said, we've tried that before, and it's never seemed to actually solve our problem. Could we think about something that would look a little bit different as a response, something that wouldn't rely on maybe giving an external speaker as much money, something that might not get the front page of the local newspaper like a big rally would, but might actually invite the community into long-term work together. And so I was part of a small group of folks who were brainstorming with one another about the idea of something like a restorative justice response to the violence that was happening in the city. What if, we said, we did the work of building the capacity in our own communities, in our own neighborhoods, to do the work of holding the community in a way that might prevent future violence, that might create the space for folks to respond to gun violence that occurs in the neighborhood in ways that are more restorative than it happened in the past, and then to do the healing work that needs to happen in communities after experiences of violence. And that seemed to get the interest of several folks. And so a group of us got together and began brainstorming about what this would look like. We had a representative from our local public health department a man named Henry, who was really excited about this as a kind of public health intervention. And so this group of people came together to put together a proposal that we would do something like create a network of neighborhood hubs that would be peace hubs responding to violence in the city. And to do that, what we would do is we would sponsor members of all of these different neighborhoods to come together, gain training in being peacemaking circle keepers, and then be commissioned kind of to go into their neighborhoods and begin holding peace circles and healing circles with the support of the broader city, with the goal of developing kind of grassroots, on the streets, neighborhood-based leaders who could both be the folks who hold space and also the folks who empower their broader communities to respond to violence in restorative and peaceful ways. And so we got the public health department on board to start providing some funds to pay for people to come and do some free trainings for members of the community. We got the city council. We had one city council member who was really invested in this in particular. The city council member at the time was representing the East Side neighborhood where so much of this violence that sparked the conversations had emerged. We had a representative from the Puyallup Tribal Council who also was on board and supporting this. And so we began to host trainings at this kind of public health owned family center that was existing on Puyallup tribal land. And we began to train dozens and dozens of folks, some folks who worked in social services, some folks who worked in government offices, some folks who worked in schools, folks who lived in the various neighborhoods where gun violence had happened in recent times. We started working with folks who were part of grassroots community organizing coalitions, folks who had been working on community safety for years. For example, some folks who had been part of the Safe Streets initiative in the neighborhood and in the area. We were inviting faith leaders to come join us. And we began the work of training dozens and dozens and dozens of leaders across the city to be able to begin doing this work. And out of that became these little hubs. We had a hub in the East Side. We had a hub in the Hilltop. We had a hub in the Central Tacoma neighborhood. We had a hub downtown. We began the work of thinking about expanding those hubs to include places like Parkland and Lakewood and Spanaway and the Franklin Pierce area, which kind of bridges between Parkland and Spanaway. I know those neighborhoods don't mean anything to most of you, but this is the way we were thinking, very neighborhood centric. And the work that I came to do in that eventually, in addition to helping to invite trainers, folks I knew in the broader restorative justice community, is the work of being the circle keeper for circle keepers. And so in addition to the neighborhood hubs that had begun launching, we had a couple of different housing communities, little housing projects or apartment complexes where folks had been trained and were interested in holding circles, as well as in certain governmental offices, in particular in public health. Oftentimes, the work of organizational meetings and planning were being done in circle processes. In our juvenile justice system, we had somebody who was really invested in the idea that we should get to the place where we never lock up our kids, and so was incorporating peace circles into that work to try to reduce recidivism as a step toward that kind of work. At the time, I was working at the local state college campus in the city. And so I was holding racial healing circles on campus and incorporating circle processes into student conduct. So we were trying to think about this as a broad neighborhood and community-based response to this work. And the work was taking off. We had trainings happening in churches, oftentimes trainings happening on Puyallup tribal ground. We had folks coming from various different organizations and communities. In particular, I want to think about some of the core people that I worked with. They're not the only people who were involved, but the aforementioned Henry, who worked in public health. I had a dear friend of mine, Roxanne, who was keeping circles, who was affiliated with the Safe Streets initiatives that have been going on for years in the neighborhood. A friend of mine, a man named Kevin, who was working in the juvenile justice system. A local community-based therapist named Morgan was doing work in circle keeping. We had a formerly incarcerated young man from the Lakewood area, a man named Terrence, who was involved. And there were so many more folks who were interested in doing this kind of work. And so we were doing this. We were building up leaders in neighborhoods. We really wanted to be neighborhood centric while being linked to one another. And so the circles that were happening in the East Side neighborhood were not exactly like the circles that were happening in the Hilltop neighborhood, which weren't exactly like the circles that were happening inside government offices, but these circles were being kept by people who had been trained together and who were linked together. And I was commissioned by the health department at the time to begin doing some research on this as an intervention. So I was looking at other programs around the country, and we began to do the research about the impact that this was having. Were we seeing declines in violence? Were we seeing increases in certain kinds of youth engagement with different forms of community leadership? Were we seeing forms of healing being reported by folks who had experienced violence? That's where we began to see the most impact, actually, is that people who had been involved in some way. They were the family member of a victim of violence, or they were a victim of violence, or they lived in a neighborhood where something like a shooting or some other form of dramatic violence had happened. We found that folks often felt much more satisfied and experienced more forms of healing through restorative processes that we were leading with peace circles, rather than through traditional modes of reporting and being involved in the criminal legal system in the area. And so we began to see the experiences of healing being reported by the community. Unfortunately, as we were just beginning to pull all of that research together, as many folks who've been involved in this kind of work know, resources can get constrained. And so the year 2020 came along. I don't know if you all remember, but in the United States, the COVID-19 pandemic first broke out in nearby Seattle, Washington. And so our funding was removed because our funding was public health funding. And so all kinds of public health funding reshifted toward addressing the COVID-19 pandemic in all kinds of ways. We kept meeting in circles. Those circles generally were happening online, especially the ones that I was keeping for circle keepers around the city. Later in that year, I also then had a cancer diagnosis. I kept keeping circles for a few months online during that process, but eventually I had to step back from that work. And I've not been involved in an explicit way since. I've also since moved to the city of Boston, where I'm now working at Boston University, but the work continues and it continues to evolve. So now there are a couple of initiatives that have emerged out of that once the city of Tacoma kind of got back to in-person meetings and circles and things like this. And so there's a couple of particular interventions that are still occurring. One, we had one of our trainers that we brought in was a man named Sarome and his colleagues who led one of the trainings. We also had a young woman from Radical Health in New York, a woman, Ivy and Dino, who came in and led some trainings. We had a woman named Ashley Ellis come in and lead some trainings. But one of the folks we brought in was a man named Sarome Fung, who came in and led some of our trainings for us to help build the capacities of the community. Well, that work and some of those folks that were trained with Sarome are still doing that work in the city, addressing youth violence in particular, drawing on people from across town, actually, so not necessarily still in the neighborhood hubs. And then also within the juvenile justice system. And I know that there's some community therapy groups, especially in the Hilltop neighborhood, who are still doing this work in that way. So the work continues to evolve. The city continues to try to respond to the violence that's happening there in innovative and experimental ways that are focused on repairing harm and restoring relationships and doing the work of healing and accountability in ways that don't rely just on punishment. But I have now been removed from that for several years, but I do check in every few years. And I know that the hubs have evolved and shifted since then, and continue in the ways that I've just named. Now, I named that partly because one of the things I think that's really important to name is that this was a community held initiative. The community held it. There was no one person. It was not just Henry in public health. It was not just me as a keeper of a circle for keepers. It was not just the folks keeping the East Side neighborhood circle or something like that. It wasn't even the city government. The city government, beyond kind of health department relations, was not actively involved in this. This was a community-based initiative, and it's continued to evolve as a community-based initiative, with the community identifying its own needs and responding to those needs in ways rooted in restorative values and practices. So that's one thing I want to name pretty explicitly as part of this story, is that it continues to evolve. It evolved from the start. It continues to evolve now. Different neighborhoods have been part of it at different times. Different organizations have been a part of it in different ways at different times, but the work continues now that I have moved on and Henry has moved on, and the city council member unfortunately passed away, and actually the tribal council member also passed away. And so life happens in community, things change, dynamics shift, and yet that work of developing neighborhood-based leaders who are leading out of restorative values continues to occur, so that continued work to decrease youth incarceration is happening in the city. Healing responses to incidents of violence among youth in particular is still happening in the city, but it continues to happen in new and innovative ways all the time. So I'm not telling the story to tell you that we actually solved all the questions of violence in my home city of Tacoma, or that what we did was anything particularly unique in the sense that it's never happened anywhere else. I actually know of a couple of other places that have tried something like a peace hub approach or a neighborhood hub approach, and the details of each one have been a little bit different. But what I share the story with you for is to name that it is possible to think in new, different, experimental, and innovative ways about how we can build peace together. That doesn't have to be a top-down kind of approach to solving violence. It doesn't have to look like throwing a whole bunch of money at big, high-profile events, but that actually, when you ask a community what it needs, what it desires in response to instances of violence, it often looks like what we need is to come together as a community, build new kinds of relationships with one another so that we can keep ourselves safe, so that we can practice peace together in ways that aren't reliant only on punishment, but on deeply restorative values and practices. So we can think about peace in new ways together, and that the experiment is always worth it. Whether it goes the way any one individual imagines from the start, it probably won't. It will evolve and change when you're doing the work in community, but it's the work in community itself that is the most restorative practice. At least that's my feeling about that. So that's a story about how that one town, that one community, tried to come together to build more peace among ourselves and with one another through the use of restorative practices like peacemaking circles.